The secret weapon of the Reich, a super-mystical closed order, but essentially a research institute. An organization shrouded, perhaps, in the largest number of myths, legends, and conspiracy theories among all organizations of the Third Reich. Ahnenerbe is an organization that was declared criminal at the Nuremberg trials because all these stories about the invention of flying saucers, paranormal abilities, telekinesis, and other mystical things that Ahnenerbe was involved in are just one story that will be told today. The second part of the story is the inhumane experiments in concentration camps on prisoners, such as experiments on blood coagulation, frostbite, and so on. That is, a huge number of people became victims of this organization. So, let's talk what is Ahnenerbe. The history of the Third Reich is closely connected with mysticism and occultism. If you look at documentary footage from the Nuremberg rallies of the NSDAP, you will see these torchlight processions in the shape of swastikas. You will see how banners are hung, how columns are formed. That is, of course, it all looks like a spectacle. It all resembles some kind of mystical, ritual action. This is visible to the naked eye. Of course, this was different from everything that was happening in other countries. That is, there was nothing like this in the Soviet Union, in the United States of America, or in Great Britain. But in Germany it was. When you look at the footage shot by Leni Riefenstahl, or at footage from any other chronicle, you see that this is some very dark, very mystical, occult action that unfolds right before your eyes. Where did all this come from? Of course, one can argue that the German nation has always been close to mysticism. We can talk about philosophy, we can talk about lifestyle. In fact, any person is inclined towards the dark side, not even towards darkness, but towards the unknown, towards mysticism, occultism. The Germans were no exception here, but perhaps it can indeed be said that in this they stood out among other European peoples. In 1918, World War I ended. Germany lost and the country had to start a new life. Germany could have taken a different path. It could have gone the communist route, but it did not. Occultism was quite widespread among the elites in 1918. In Munich, an organization called the Thule Society was created. The myth of the Atlanteans would develop and be revived in Hitler's Germany. In 1918, the occultist, mystic, and conspiracy theorist Rudolf von Sabbatendorf founded this Thule Society, which included Munich intellectuals interested in and striving to touch this mysticism. What is the history of this society? Why was it created in the first place? According to legend, the Atlanteans, after Atlantis sank, moved to this island or place called Thule, whose location is unclear, either closer to Iceland or closer to Greenland, somewhere in Scandinavia. So they moved there and gave rise to the Aryan race. The true Aryans, according to the Thule Society, were descended from the Atlantean fathers and were the primary race on Earth. The Germans were believed to have descended from these Atlanteans, these Hyperboreans, from this great and important Nordic civilization, and the Germans were its main descendants. The search for these roots and these connections was the philosophy of the Thule Society. The society was definitely conspiratorial, and it was definitely racist, because at that time a man named Hermann Wirth appeared. He wrote a work on the origin of humanity. What was written in this work? There is a Nordic race that created everything beautiful on Earth, invented language, and invented culture. And then there was southern Gondwana. There were all sorts of subhumans, from blacks to Slavs. These were all second-level people who adopted the Nordic language, distorted it, and through their incestuous relationships with Nordic people, degenerated humanity. Therefore, the Germans more or less preserve themselves as they are descendants of this main dominant race, and it is necessary for the Germans to unite to preserve this racial purity and to actually show that they are the main people on Earth, superhumans. Everyone else is second-rate people. For its adherents, this was an absolutely scientifically justified theory, and all kinds of evidence were collected and invented for it. And as we will see later, it was taken quite seriously by the German elites. It cannot be said that it was a circle of some imposters or fraudsters, although there were those who hung around in this Thule Society. Certainly not. There were professors in Munich, major Munich industrialists, and in particular, a man named Otto Rahn. He conducted excavations in France, excavating Montségur, the last stronghold of the Cathars, and was looking for the Holy Grail there, because he clearly believed that the Holy Grail had been taken there. He was a famous archaeologist. Thus, the Munich elite, the German elite, began to embrace the ideas of the Thule Society. That's on one side. On the other hand, Germany was living in a state of national disgrace, and this mythology that we are the descendants of a superior race suited it very well. Then those who would later become the main figures of the National Socialist German Workers' Party joined this Thule Society. The first to join was Rudolf Hess. In the Thule Society, there was a professor named Karl Hoffhofer, and his assistant was Rudolf Hess. Hess joined the Thule Society. He really liked these ideas of the superiority of the Aryan race and the superiority of the German nation. He got involved in it, and at some point brought Hitler there, who also became deeply impressed by all these ideas. There will always be debates about whether Hitler believed in this mysticism or used it as a political tool. Hans Frank, the future Nazi criminal, also joined the Thule Society. At this moment, in the cradle of this mysticism, against the backdrop of this occultism and the rise of the Nazi movement, the German Workers' Party was created. At the same time, the swastika appeared. If we look at the swastika, we now know for sure that it is something associated with Hitler's Germany. In fact, this symbol is older than Germany itself. It first appears in Buddhist texts, that is, in Hinduism, in the East, in China. The swastika has survived to this day. If you go to Bali, if you go to India, you will see the swastika used in ornaments. It is a protective symbol, a sign of well-being and prosperity. This swastika first appears in the Thule Society, and then transfers to the symbols of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At some point when Hitler was already becoming stronger as a politician, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as we know, was organized. This swastika in a white circle on a red banner was personally approved by Hitler and became the standard of Hitler's Germany, first in the party, then as the national flag. The Thule Society develops, and at the same time, Hitler's rise to political power takes place. All these people are closely intertwined with each other. In the early 1920s, the key figure Heinrich Himmler joins the party. At that moment, Himmler begins to search for a foundation, a new philosophy for himself. He had been a Catholic, and for some time religion interested him, but then he realized that religion gave him nothing, and so he began to search for new foundations and found himself within the circle of the Thule Society. He absorbed its ideas. Himmler, known as the main person responsible for the Holocaust, the one who signed all the orders for the extermination of people and the final solution to the Jewish question, embraced this philosophy with great enthusiasm. Because, aside from the fact that it emphasized the superiority of the German nation, the Thule Society was a fiercely anti-Semitic organization. They published the newspaper Beobachter in Munich, which would later become the Völkischer Beobachter, the main propaganda organ of Nazi Germany. It was an aggressively militant anti-Semitic paper. The leaflets portrayed Jews as a festering sore on the body of the German nation, blaming them for the loss of the war. They claimed that Jews controlled everything. The newspaper was created by very educated people, presenting fabricated evidence. Himmler found this ideology wildly appealing. From childhood, Himmler was drawn to occultism and mysticism. At some point, he began to see himself as the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler, the German leader who first united the Germanic tribes. In general, two parallel currents, the occult mystical and National Socialist, which were very closely linked, began to work together. In 1935, Hermann Wirth held an exhibition called The Heritage of German Ancestors. It prominently displayed the dominance of Germanic civilization, with all the artifacts found during excavation stones, runes highlighting its contributions to the world. This exhibition presented the first seed of the idea that Christianity, which had spread throughout Europe, had stifled the Germans because Germanic shrines were destroyed and the pre-Christian pagan nation had been crushed. Himmler visited this exhibition, and he liked it very much. At the same time, a man named Richard Walther Darrer, the Minister of Agriculture, became involved with the exhibition. By this time, he had already written the work Blood and Soil, where he talked about ancient Germans and the true bonds of the German spirit, which fit well with this ideology. On one hand, we understand that Hitler was influenced by mysticism, but probably to a lesser extent. However, Himmler was fully consumed by it, the reincarnation of Henry the Fowler, the creation of a new religion, the Black Order of the SS, the monastic brotherhood. These ideas would continue to manifest. But the key point is that we cannot say that they were all occult mystics who genuinely believed in these ideas. One example is the appearance of a man named Karl Maria Willigut in Himmler's circle. On one side, Willigut was from old German aristocracy, but on the other, he was a former psychiatric patient. He told everyone that his lineage traced back to Thor, the Norse god. Himmler loved this story because Willigut was involved in excavations, claiming that there were countless ancient Germanic temples and sanctuaries with magical artifacts that granted powers like telepathy and telekinesis. Himmler began to support all of this. Alongside Willigut was Wirth, who justified all of this using ancient texts and sagas. Then, there was the matter of the runes. If we examine what the SS is, it involves two iconic runes. These were Nordic runes that were widely used in Germany, not only in the SS but also on the insignia of various regiments. All of this flourished in full bloom. In 1936, Hitler fiercely criticized Hermann Wirth, the chairman of the Ahnenerbe Society. He was displeased with all the occultism and other nonsense that filled the organization, while Hitler highly valued Heinrich Himmler, calling him Loyal Heinrich. He knew Himmler had a small, irrational obsession. Himmler was an excellent courtier, a brilliant manager, skilled in bureaucratic maneuvering and political intrigue, and an effective companion. Because of these qualities, Hitler appreciated him, but wanted him to keep his mystical interests separate from the core of the Third Reich. Wirth, however, became the target of Hitler's harsh criticism. Realizing this wouldn't end well, Himmler expelled Wirth from Ahnenerbe in 1937 and took over as its head. Under Himmler's leadership, Ahnenerbe was transformed from a society studying German ancestral heritage into a research institute encompassing all areas of German society. Christianity was indeed a hindrance to the ideological plans of the Third Reich. Himmler saw the need to create a new religion that could replace Christianity and better align with Nazi goals. He proposed returning to the pagan beliefs of the ancient Germanic peoples. One of his projects was the rehabilitation of the image of witches, whom he believed represented ancient Germanic spirituality and were victims of Christian inquisitions. For support this, the Ahnenerbe collected information on witches who had been burned across Europe. These records were meant to serve as evidence that witches, allegedly bearers of ancient magic and knowledge, were helping people, but Christianity persecuted and destroyed them to suppress the German spirit and erase traces of ancient traditions. As part of this project, a database was created that documented 35,000 cases of witch executions gathered from across Europe over the past 400 years. In this way, the Nazis sought to build a new ideology and culture based on what they claimed were revived elements of ancient heritage. Christianity was an obstacle for the Third Reich. It was necessary to create a new religion. Himmler gladly played along and sold Hitler on the idea that Germans needed a new religion. It was not Christianity, let's turn to paganism. They gathered evidence of burned witches from all over Europe to present it as proof that witches were actually amazing, helped people, and that Christians burned them to make German civilization, German spirit, and German spirituality disappear. They collected data from all over Europe and created a registry of 35,000 witches burned across Europe over the past 400 years. Himmler had a very clear plan: we must introduce the Ahnenerbe as a scientific research institute into propaganda, religion, children's school, and institutional education into party cells. In this way, we will be responsible for spirituality and ideological training. In reality, Himmler saw himself as Hitler's successor, and he created the entire structure of the SS, which transformed from Hitler's guard units into a vast second army. By creating his own religion, he established his own almost monastic Black Order, with the aim of leading the Third Reich after victory over the Soviet Union. The Germans were searching for these artifacts everywhere. As I mentioned, they attempted to excavate the Holy Grail in Montsegur, the last refuge of the Cathars. They searched for crystal skulls in Latin America. An expedition to Lake Titicaca was planned for the 1940s, but it was unsuccessful due to the outbreak of war. There was a project called Thor's Hammer. The madman Karl Maria Willigut, who traced his lineage back to Thor, hypothesized that Thor's hammer was actually the most powerful electrical weapon. Ahnenerbe was developing an electrical weapon that was supposed to collect lightning energy, convert it into a strike against enemy equipment, and disable it without using artillery shells. This project existed and was funded, and it was called Thor's Hammer. In 1934, the history of the Wilsberg Castle began. Originally, it was to be Himmler's residence, where ASS school was planned a kind of training ground for personnel. It was intended to include ASS University, a training camp, and other educational institutions. The project started in 1934. Why was this particular castle chosen? Carl Maria Williget, who famously traced his lineage back to the god Thor, sold this idea to Himmler. Wewelsburg Castle is located near significant German sanctuaries on one side. It is the Teutoburg Forest, where Germanic tribes first defeated the legions of the Roman Empire on the other side. It is the Externstein, an ancient cult site of the Germanic tribes, with their characteristic stone formations. It was there, near these sanctuaries, that the Irminsul tree grew, which was worshipped by the ancient Germans. Charlemagne felled it during the Frankish era. It was the tree of life for the Germanic people, and with its destruction, the process of Christianization began, which, according to Himmler, displaced and suppressed the Germanic race. Not far from these places is Wewelsburg Castle. Initially, Himmler planned to build ASS school there, but then he turned the castle into his residence. This marked the beginning of the history of the Black Order of the SS. The SS was not merely an organization with military units and Hitler's personal guard. Himmler envisioned it as a monastic brotherhood. The famous SS ring with the death's head, personally handed out by Himmler, became the symbol of this brotherhood. These rings, now rare and prized by numismatists, were made of silver and adorned with a death's head, SS runes, and the owner's name. When a person died, the ring was sent back to Wewelsburg Castle and was kept in the crypt, in the pantheon of fallen heroes. Loss, sale, or exchange of the ring was considered unacceptable. It belonged to the order. The tower is divided into several floors. At the bottom was supposed to be a crypt, where the most important SS heroes were to be buried, and at the top was to be a circular hall. Its dome, if I'm not mistaken, has 48 windows. This is the Hall of the Holy Grail. An eternal flame burned here, and the pipes for the gas used for the flame are still preserved. The most famous symbol in this hall is the black sun, a mosaic of which still decorates the floor. This symbol also has ancient Tibetan origins. Tourists can visit Wewelsburg Castle and see all this with their own eyes. Himmler made the castle his residence, and it had to be rebuilt from scratch. Wewelsburg Castle is shaped like a triangle, resembling the Spear of Longinus. Everything was constructed and based on symbols that Himmler actively cultivated. At some point, Himmler became fascinated with yoga and Hinduism. He delved into these teachings, preparing to lead the future world order. Runes and artifacts were brought to the castle. In 1945, as the Soviet army approached, the castle was blown up, but it has since been restored and is open for visitors. The silver death's head rings and the Spear of Destiny were supposed to be kept in this castle, as I mentioned. There is also a legend about the famous mythical battle at the Last Birch, which supposedly took place on or near the site of the castle. This battle symbolizes the clash of Western and Eastern civilizations in ancient times. As a result, there was a division into two tribes. The Eastern tribes sought to absorb the Germanic nation, but history is silent about how this battle of good and evil, in their interpretation, ended. In other words, everything was built on a completely mystical foundation. Himmler was preparing a new religion. For example, the Hakon Department, which dealt with witches, was a conspiratorial and mystical organization that collected materials on witches from all over Europe. Meanwhile, the M Department was a practical branch of the Ahnenerbe, dealing with mathematics under the leadership of a man named Bozak. According to various sources, members of the Ahnenerbe were involved in all technological projects of the Third Reich. By the end of the war, the Third Reich had achieved significant progress. For example, the first jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the V-2 ballistic missile, and the Germans were on the verge of creating a nuclear reactor and developing biological weapons. Members of the Ahnenerbe were involved in all these structures, who had access to the archives and were engaged in the research and development. Himmler involved his staff in all scientific developments. What happened to them after the war? The archives fell into the hands of the Allies. A man named Bozak, who led the M Department, disappeared without a trace after the war, as if he had never existed. Wolfram Sievers, who headed the Ahnenerbe, was present at the Nuremberg trials. He was not tried at Nuremberg itself, but later he appeared on the list of individuals subject to punishment and was hanged because he had information that the organizers of the Nuremberg trials might have preferred to keep secret. The Americans conducted 2 operations Paperclip and Clouds aimed at bringing German scientists and Ahnenerbe personnel to the United States. For example, Werner von Braun, who was not a member of the Ahnenerbe but worked on the V-2 rocket development, was brought to the U.S. While Congress had prohibited the entry and work of Ahnenerbe members in the U.S., they were secretly smuggled in, and these operations were kept classified. The Ahnenerbe archives remain classified both in the U.S. and other countries. There may be information in them that is not meant to be disclosed. Himmler did not fall into the hands of justice. In 1945, he began separate negotiations with the Allies, displaying incredible cynicism. He also reached out through intermediaries to the International Jewish Congress, offering his assistance. The man responsible for the Holocaust proposed to release 100,000 Jews from concentration camps as a gesture of goodwill, attempting to save himself in the process. When Hitler learned of these negotiations, he chose not to make Himmler his successor but instead appointed Karl Donitz, considering Himmler a traitor. Ultimately, after the war, Himmler was arrested. He did not survive to the Nuremberg trials and was not hanged. However, Wolfram Sievers, the head of the Ahnenerbe, was later hanged. Nonetheless, all other Ahnenerbe members lived long lives. For example, Jürgen von Groningen died in 2003. They continued their activities, some taught, some engaged in scientific work, and some moved to Latin America, where they fought against cocaine plantations. Overall, they did not face severe punishment after the war. The Ahnenerbe archives fell into Allied hands, the castle was destroyed and then restored. This marks the end of the Ahnenerbe story.